Picture a dry, sweltering summer day in a rural Danish village.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And out of nowhere, this clown comes sprinting into the town square. He is fully decked out.
Right.
You know, the white face paint, the oversized shoes, the bright red nose.
Just the full circus getup.
Yeah, the ridiculous wig and everything. And he's panting. He's waving his arms frantically, and he starts screaming at the top of his lungs that the traveling circus, which is set up just outside of town, has caught fire.
Oh, wow.
The flames are spreading through the dry fields. They're heading straight for the village. So he's begging everyone to grab buckets of water and come help.
And you can imagine the reaction. The villagers look at him, they look at each other, and they just start clapping.
Yeah, they think it's a brilliant marketing stunt for the evening show.
They're laughing until they cry. And the clown is pleading with them. Tears are streaking his grease paint. He's swearing that this isn't a joke, that destruction is literally minutes away.
But the more desperate he gets, the better they think his acting is.
Yeah, they just cheer louder. And while they're applauding this performance, the fire sweeps into the village and everything burns to the ground.
It's a haunting image, really.
It is. That story actually comes from a famous Danish philosopher, and it serves as the opening metaphor for the text we are unpacking today.
And for those of you joining us, we're doing a comprehensive, exhaustive deep dive into part 1 of Joseph Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity.
Yes, and our source material is the primary text of part 1 itself. We're also supplementing it with scholarly commentaries that analyze his very specific philosophical proposals.
And just to set the ground rules for you listening, our mission for this deep dive is to systematically unpack Ratzinger's exact words. We're looking at the modern predicament of faith, the primacy of reason, which is logos, and the relational nature of God.
We should clarify, we aren't doing any psychological speculation here.
No, none at all. We aren't projecting how the author felt or analyzing the cultural anxieties of the 1960s when he wrote it. We are focusing strictly on the intellectual architecture of his arguments.
Which brings us back to that clown in the village square, because Ratzinger uses that allegory to describe the situation of the theologian, and really any believer in the modern world.
The believer comes bearing this urgent message about reality itself, about the fire that threatens human existence.
But the modern world looks at the messenger and only sees a clown costume.
And the costume, in this case, being the medieval terminology, the traditional language, the ancient dogmas.
Yeah, people categorize the believer by the historical role they seem to be playing. They assume that whatever's being said has no actual bearing on practical, everyday reality.
It's just a performance.
The immediate temptation when you face that kind of mockery is to try and fix the PR problem. You think, I'll just take off the clown suit.
Let's strip away the ancient vocabulary.
Yeah, let's adopt a completely secular wardrobe, demythologize the language, and then people will finally take the warning seriously.
But Ratzinger argues that simply changing the costume is a total failure. It doesn't fix the problem at all.
Because if you strip away the historical vocabulary, you don't suddenly find a frictionless path to modern acceptance. The dilemma runs so much deeper than just semantics.
He points out that the true predicament is internal. The believer today is plagued by the exact same fundamental doubt as the unbeliever.
The crisis isn't just about how the outside world perceives the faith. It's about the very ground the believer is standing on.
I really want to dig into this because he uses another piece of imagery to describe this precarious situation, and it's terrifying.
Oh, the shipwreck.
Yeah. He references a French play featuring a Jesuit missionary who survives a shipwreck. This missionary is lashed to a loose piece of wood, like a beam from the sunken ship, and he is just drifting over a bottomless, raging ocean.
Fastened to a beam with the beam fastened to nothing, just drifting over the abyss. Ratzinger writes that the situation of the contemporary believer could hardly be more accurately described.
Only a loose plank bobbing over the void seems to hold the believer up. The ocean of nothingness, of this deep uncertainty, is constantly seething right beneath him.
Let's try to make this tangible for you listening. Imagine you're walking out onto one of those glass-bottomed observation decks, the ones suspended over a deep canyon.
Oh, those are terrifying.
Both the believer and the staunch skeptic are standing on that same glass floor. The believer is terrified by the structural cracks they see forming in the glass under their boots. They are acutely aware of the sheer drop beneath them.
But I have to push back on the premise here. I understand why the believer feels insecure in the modern world. But why does the text insist that the staunch, science-driven atheist, the person who trusts only empirical data and feels very confident in their worldview, is just as insecure as the struggling believer.
That's a fair question.
Doesn't the skeptic feel like they're standing on solid rock rather than a loose plank?
Well, that is the assumption. But our text challenges it by introducing a complementary tale from a Jewish philosopher.
Okay, what happens in this one?
In this story, an Enlightenment scholar, a man of pure rationalism, armed with all the latest scientific and philosophical proofs, he goes to visit a learned rabbi. The scholar intends to completely debunk the rabbi's faith.
He walks in ready for a debate.
Yeah, armed with airtight logic. But before he can even launch into his arguments, the rabbi simply looks at him and says, "But perhaps it is true after all."
Oh, wow. And that single, quiet sentence completely unnerves the scholar. His resistance just shatters.
Because doubt is a two-way street. Ratzinger argues that just as the believer is constantly threatened by the abyss of nothingness and the temptation of unbelief, the unbeliever is haunted by the unrejectable, perhaps.
The skeptic has chosen to explain the world as a self-contained, purely material whole.
But the skeptic can never be 100% certain of the autonomy of that closed system. You cannot empirically prove that nothing exists beyond the material boundary.
So that perhaps it is true after all echoes in the back of the unbeliever's mind.
Yeah. So both sides really are looking down through that glass floor. The believer fears the glass will shatter and reveal nothingness. The unbeliever fears the glass will shatter and reveal God.
That captures the dynamic beautifully. Ratzinger states that no one can lay God and his kingdom on the table like a physical specimen in a laboratory.
The believer can't do it, which causes acute doubt.
But the unbeliever can't empirically prove the absence of God's overarching reality either, which leaves the door wide open to that terrifying, perhaps.
Doubt unites them both. The text says the believer's faith is present against doubt, while the unbeliever's underlying intuition of meaning is present through the form of doubt.
This shared human vulnerability is fascinating. This inability to escape the tension of uncertainty forces us to fundamentally redefine what the act of believing actually is.
It really does.
Because if both the believer and the unbeliever are experiencing deep structural doubt, then faith cannot simply be defined as the psychological absence of doubt.
It requires a profound shift in how we understand the mechanics of belief. We have to move from the psychological feeling of certainty to the structural foundation of the word credo, the Latin for "I believe."
And Ratzinger does this by taking us back to the linguistic roots of a word we use all the time without thinking, which is amen.
We say amen at the end of prayers, and we usually was treated as a sign-off.
Yeah, it's like pressing send on an email or putting a period at the end of a sentence.
But in its ancient Hebrew root, aim, it means firmness, ground, or taking a stand. Ratzinger points specifically to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 9, where it says, "If you do not believe, you will have no foothold."
Or, translated more literally from that root, if you do not hold firm, you will not have a stand.
This linguistic connection reveals such a deep contrast between the modern mindset and the mindset of faith. Our source text contrasts two pairs of concepts here, know-make versus stand-understand.
The modern scientific era operates almost exclusively on the premise of know-make.
This is often referred to philosophically as verum quia factum truth, is only that which we have made, measured, or altered ourselves.
In this worldview, we only truly know what we can construct in a laboratory, or manipulate through technology, or prove with a mathematical equation.
Think about how deeply ingrained that is for us today. If I can't build a digital model of it, or write a line of code for it, or measure its chemical composition, then it doesn't count as real knowledge.
Ratzinger points out that systems like Marxism and positivism took this to its absolute logical conclusion. They tried to find the entire meaning of humanity within the realm of the makeable.
The idea is, if we can just construct the perfect economic system or invent the perfect technology, we will have finally secured the meaning of human existence. Truth is entirely equated with practicability.
However, faith asserts a completely different relationship to reality, which is stand understand. Faith argues that humanity does not live on practicability alone. A person lives on meaning.
And here is the crucial philosophical distinction Ratzinger makes, meaning that is self-made is ultimately hollow.
Let's explore that because it sounds counterintuitive to modern ears. We are constantly told to make our own meaning in life. Why is self-made meaning hollow?
Because if we invent our own meaning, it is merely a tool. It's a psychological comfort blanket. It is not an objective, solid ground upon which we can stake our lives when a real crisis hits.
If you made it yourself, you know deep down that it only exists in your own head.
Yeah. Believing, therefore, is not blind guesswork. It's not trying to calculate an equation with missing variables. It is the act of taking a stand on a meaning that we cannot make ourselves.
It is entrusting ourselves to a foundation that precedes our own manufacturing
But
capabilities.
I know there's a natural objection to this.
Yeah, I need to challenge this distinction. If faith operates completely outside the realm of practical making and empirical knowledge, isn't that just a massive, well, an enormous intellectual retreat?
It sounds like it initially.
Doesn't this concede the entire ground of rationality to the scientists and leave faith in the realm of the irrational? By saying, we stand on what we cannot make, aren't we just admitting we have no rational proof and we're just closing our eyes and jumping?
It's a vital pushback, and the text anticipates it. Ratzinger argues that taking this stand is not an abandonment of reason at all. It is actually an alignment with the ultimate reason.
How so?
Understanding grows out of standing. When the ancient Greek translators took that Hebrew text of Isaiah, they translated, "If you do not believe, you will have no foothold," as if you do not believe, you will not understand.
So they changed foothold to understand. That seems like a strange leap.
Ratzinger points out that this is not a mistranslation and a profound conceptual bridge. Because to truly understand reality, you have to first stand on a ground that makes understanding possible in the first place.
Okay, I see. Reason itself requires a foundation. If the cosmos is just a product of irrational, random collisions of matter, just atoms bumping into each other in the dark for billions of years, then our own reasoning minds are just random byproducts of that irrationality.
Yeah.
And if our brains are just accidental meat computers, why should we trust our own reason to begin with?
That is the point the text makes.
Yeah.
Faith, Ratzinger proposes, is the decision to trust that the ground of reality is inherently meaningful. It is the decision that meaning is not a secondary illusion we invent to feel better, but the primary architecture of existence.
Which leads directly to the central argument for the primacy of the Logos. Saying, I believe in God, isn't just affirming a warm religious sentiment or joining a cultural club.
No, it is fundamentally a philosophical decision regarding the architecture of reality. It is the choice that logos, which translates to meaning, idea, freedom, reason, word, stands not merely at the end of an evolutionary process, but at the very beginning of it all.
To really grasp this, we have to look at how Ratzinger breaks down the philosophical definitions of matter and mind. He defines matter very specifically as being that does not understand itself.
A rock exists. A cloud of hydrogen gas exists. But they have no comprehension of their own existence.
Mind, on the other hand, is defined as being that is present to itself. It is self-aware, it comprehends.
So the materialistic worldview posits that matter being that does not understand itself is the original default reality. Mind, consciousness, and thought are just late-stage accidents. They are secondary byproducts of unthinking matter randomly combining over immense stretches of time.
Contrast that with the Christian faith, which aligns with the philosophical idealistic solution. This worldview decides that all matter is the product of an original thought.
Thought precedes matter. Being itself is ultimately being thought by a singular original consciousness.
The intellectual structure we discover in the physical world, the laws of physics, the elegance of mathematics, the intricate coding of DNA, all of that exists because reality is the expression of a creative premeditation.
I like to use a modern analogy here. It's somewhat like a computer programmer generating a complex virtual environment.
Oh, sure.
The digital trees and the digital gravity in that virtual environment didn't invent the code. The code structures the environment from the outside in.
If a character inside that game discovers mathematical laws governing their digital cosmos, it implies a mind that wrote the math.
This perspective changes one's entire approach to science. Science is no longer imposing human order on a chaotic void. Science is discovering the order that was already premeditated by a creator.
And that premeditation means the world is fundamentally intelligible and purposeful. When a scientist discovers a new law of thermodynamics, they are, in a very real sense, rethinking the original thoughts of the creator.
Reason's accord with God and God's accord with reason is guaranteed because God is logos.
But I have to push back again using that very analogy. If all reality is just God's thought or God's computer code, how is the Christian God any different from a cold, detached supercomputer?
That's a crucial distinction to make.
Or, historically speaking, how is this any different from the distant first cause or the unmoved mover of the ancient Greek philosophers? A cosmic architect might design a beautiful, mathematically perfect building, but that doesn't mean the architect loves the bricks.
This is where the text takes a fascinating turn. This crucial question points to the pivotal historical moment when the God of the philosophers collided with the biblical God. It is the moment the concept of the absolute was transformed forever.
Let's trace that collision because the history here is incredible. Ratzinger looks at the biblical concept of God through the ancient names Elohim and Yahweh, specifically focusing on the revelation at the burning bush where God identifies himself to Moses as I am who I am.
When the early church began spreading its message out of the Middle East and into the broader Greco-Roman world, it faced a really difficult choice. It could align its God with the mythological gods of the pagans, the gods of political custom, the gods of agriculture, the localized gods of specific mountains or rivers.
But the early church made a deliberate, radical decision. It rejected the localized mythological gods entirely.
Instead, it aligned its faith with the God of the philosophers. It claimed that the God of Israel was the Logos, the supreme reason and foundational being that the Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle had deduced through pure logic.
But, and this is the paradigm shift, Christianity introduced an enormous shock to the Greek philosophical system.
Oh, definitely.
The ancient Greeks had indeed deduced a supreme being, but to them it was an absurd, almost insulting idea that this transcendent, absolute entity would care about the petty affairs of humans.
A supreme being dealing with the daily struggles of a specific tribe wandering in the desert. It seemed entirely illogical to the sophisticated Hellenistic mind.
Ratzinger addresses this brilliantly. He argues that our modern minds often harbor the exact same Greek prejudice. We look at the vastness of space, the billions of galaxies, the sheer scale of light years, and we think, God is too big to care about my small, insignificant life.
But the text points out that this is actually a very petty, limited, anthropomorphic way of thinking about power.
Yeah, we project our own human limitations onto God. We imagine God as a human CEO running a multinational corporation. The CEO is way too busy managing the macroeconomics of the company to care about a single broken bolt on the assembly line in a factory 1,000 miles away.
Yes, we project our own limited capacity for attention onto the infinite. But true infinity means encompassing both the maximum and the minimum perfectly.
Ratzinger argues that the highest power is not demonstrated through sheer physical force, like a cosmic storm or an unstoppable physical law.
The highest power is demonstrated through the freedom of self-giving love, what the Greeks termed agape. God is so infinite that he can be intimately present to the finite without diminishing his majesty.
I really need to frame this in my own words because the paradox Ratzinger identifies here is breathtaking. The biblical God is both the absolute being, the foundational math and logos of all reality, and a personal you who can be invoked in prayer.
It brings together two concepts that the ancient world thought were mutually exclusive. The absolute ground of being is not a silent equation. It is a speaking, loving person.
So, what does this all mean for us? The idea that the fundamental laws of physics are somehow rooted in a personal love is a huge concept to contemplate. But if God is this absolute being and also a personal you, how does the text bridge the structural gap between an infinite creator and a finite human trying to speak to him?
How does the infinite relate to the finite without completely obliterating it?
Yeah, exactly.
This brings us to what might be the most radical of Ratzinger's proposals in the entire text. The way God bridges this gap is through his very nature as a Trinity.
The Trinity isn't just a complicated theological puzzle. It is what fundamentally redefines what it means to be a person and what it means to relate.
Let's dive deep into Trinitarian ontology, because Ratzinger emphasizes right away that the doctrine of the Trinity didn't originate from a group of theologians sitting in a dusty room doing abstract metaphysical math, trying to figure out how 1 equals 3.
It didn't come from theory. It came from historical experience.
True, the early Christians experienced Jesus Christ in history. They witnessed a man who constantly called God Father, praying to him in intense personal dialogue.
Yet simultaneously, this same Jesus demonstrated and claimed that he was entirely one with God. He forgave sins, he commanded nature with a word, he claimed the divine name for himself.
So the early church was faced with this complex historical data. Jesus speaks to God as Father, yet Jesus operates as God.
If Jesus is just an intermediate being, like a demigod or an exalted angel, then he actually separates us from the true God. He's just a middleman.
But if he is fully God, how can he speak to the Father? Is he just talking to himself?
To resolve this, Ratzinger exhaustively explains the concept of Trinitarian ontology. And to understand it, we have to look at how the ancient Greeks viewed reality.
For them, reality was essentially divided into two categories: substance or accidents, the one or the many, Relation was considered merely an accident, a secondary attribute of a substance.
Let's break that down with an everyday example. Take a human being. A man is a substance. His existence as a human is his substance.
Being a father, or being a son, or being a brother, those are just incidental relations he happens to have.
He could have no children, and he would still fully possess his substance as a human. The relation is secondary to his being.
But Christianity introduces a third revolutionary option into philosophy: relationality as foundational being. God is not a solitary, isolated substance dwelling in eternal loneliness. God is, in his very essence, communion.
Ratzinger states that the overstepping of the singular is implicit in the concept of person.
Which means to be a person inherently means to be in relation to another. If God is the ultimate person, the highest form of personhood, he must possess relation within himself.
Thus, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not three different substances, but three pure relations subsisting within the one essence of God.
Okay, let's look at a specific statement from the Gospel of John that Ratzinger analyzes to prove this. The Son can do nothing of himself.
On the surface, if you just read that, it sounds like a statement of extreme weakness. It sounds like Jesus lacks power and has no agency of his own.
But Ratzinger turns that interpretation completely on its head. It does not mean Jesus is weak or a lesser being. It means he is pure relation.
His entire being is defined by his relationship to the Father. He holds nothing back for himself as a private, fenced-off territory of isolation.
Because he's pure reception and pure reflection of the Father, he coincides completely with the Father. Substance and relation are no longer opposed in God. They are co-principles.
I have to pause here because this is the exact moment where the biggest misunderstandings happen. Does this mean there are three gods?
Many people ask that.
How does our text maintain the strict monotheism of the Old Testament, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one," while simultaneously claiming God is a dialogue of persons?
It is a delicate, profound balance of singular substance and plural relations. God is one in substance, meaning there is only one intellect, one will, one power.
There are not three separate minds thinking three different thoughts, or three separate wills pulling in different directions.
The distinction lies entirely and exclusively on the level of relationship.
So how do we distinguish them if the substance is one?
The Father is the act of giving everything. The Son is the act of receiving and returning everything. The Spirit is the unity of that love poured out.
The unity of God is not the rigid, inflexible indivisibility of a mathematical point or a single, isolated atom.
The highest form of unity is the unity created by love. The multi-unity that grows in love is a more radical, truer unity than sheer, static isolation.
A unity of love is actually stronger than a unity of isolation. That is a profound metaphysical shift. It implies that at the very bottom of reality, beneath the quarks and the quantum fields and the dark matter, you don't find a cold, dead equation. You find an eternal dialogue of love.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the text, it dictates how a human being must interact with this God. Because God is fundamentally relational, the act of believing in him cannot be done in isolation.
You cannot connect with a relational God through solitary, detached speculation. The "I believe" necessarily requires a "we."
Which transitions us perfectly into the final major proposal of Part 1, the experiment of faith and the ecclesial word.
Ratzinger roots the Apostles' Creed, the basic statement of Christian belief, in its original historical context. It wasn't written as a textbook summary by academics. It was the baptismal dialogue of the early Roman Church.
During the sacrament of baptism, the candidate wasn't handed a scroll to read and sign. The candidate was asked 3 questions. Do you believe in God the Father? Do you believe in Jesus Christ the Son? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit?
And the candidate responded to each question with "Credo, I believe." Faith, therefore, is not a private philosophy cooked up in someone's head while sitting alone in a forest. It is a received word that comes from outside the self.
Our text draws a sharp contrast here between the philosophical method and the Christian method.
The philosopher is the solitary thinker producing a thought from within their own mind. They observe the world, they deduce, they formulate an idea independently.
But the Christian is an individual receiving a word from a community. Because the word is received, the primacy of the word means that faith is inherently social and communal.
When you say "I believe," you are simultaneously saying "we believe." You are binding yourself to the historical church across space and time.
Furthermore, Ratzinger asserts that there is no such thing as a mere observer when it comes to God. Pure objectivity in the realm of theology is a self-deception.
The higher the truth, the more it demands personal involvement. You cannot study God the way a biologist studies a microbe under a microscope, remaining totally detached and unaffected by the specimen.
Ratzinger actually calls faith an experiment that one must enter into. You cannot understand it from the sidelines. You have to step onto the playing field.
But I know modern listeners will struggle with this concept. Modern society prizes absolute intellectual independence above almost everything else. We hate being told we must rely on an institution or a received word.
We want to figure it out for ourselves independently.
How does the text justify this reliance on the historical, sometimes heavily flawed human structure of the church to deliver this ultimate truth?
He justifies it through the very nature of what is being delivered. If the truth being delivered is a God who is pure relation, a God who entered history as a human being to form a covenant, then that truth must be mediated historically and relationally.
A community of human beings, despite their flaws, is the only vessel logically capable of transmitting a truth that is fundamentally about interpersonal communion.
If you reject the communal reception, you are rejecting the relational nature of the truth itself. Faith requires the humility to receive what you did not invent from a community you do not control.
We have covered an immense amount of intellectual ground today. Let's briefly recap this intensive journey through Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity, Part 1.
We began by examining the shared abyss of doubt, recognizing that both the believer and the unbeliever navigate an ocean of uncertainty, confronting that unrejectable perhaps.
We then explored how faith is not a blind leap into the dark, but taking a firm stand on the structural foundation of meaning, the philosophical shift from a world of no-make to a worldview of stand-understand.
We unpack the primacy of the logos, the philosophical decision that creative reason rather than unthinking random matter is the original source of all being.
We witness the paradigm-shifting collision between the distant, apathetic God of the philosophers and the personal, biblical God who reveals himself through self-giving love.
Which culminated in the revolution of Trinitarian ontology, the realization that God is pure relation, and that the highest form of unity is communion.
And finally, we saw how this relational God can only be known through a relational communal reception of the creed within the historical context of the Church.
Throughout all of this, a recurring motif in Ratzinger's work is the absolute impossibility of remaining neutral.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a final philosophical thought to ponder. Consider Ratzinger's scientific metaphor of the experiment of faith. In modern quantum physics, we know that the observer inherently alters the experiment. The mere act of observation collapses the wave function. You cannot measure a system without interacting with it. Ratzinger proposes that when confronting the ultimate foundation of reality, neutral observation is a philosophical illusion. You cannot know the truth of a relational God from a detached, purely objective distance. The truth of a relational God can only be accessed by entering into relation yourself.